boys and girls and parents. How are you this morning? My name is Ralph Rivers, as Ms. Lewis has already eloquently introduced me. And I hope I'm still as famous as I was when she said so after I get through talking. First of all, I'd like to welcome you to this wonderful multicultural festival. And I just really enjoyed the boys and girls so far. How about all the rest of you? Just so you know, Toastmasters is an organization dedicated to communication. That means that we tell stories and we give speeches and we learn how to communicate. Communication, we feel, is the most important thing that human beings do, because without communication, we couldn't have science and we couldn't have conversation. We couldn't have a lot of things, right? Yeah. Okay. And so I've been doing this for about, well, if I told you, you promised not to laugh. 43 years. 43 years I've been telling stories. And this is my first opportunity to speak to young people about your age. And I want to tell you about a young man that I wrote about and that you're going to be introduced to as Joshua Judd, the bicycle boy. Joshua Judd had 2 left feet. No. I know that a lot of you feel that 2 left feet signifies being clumsy. Like a guy that can't dance without dancing on his partner's feet. Or someone that's always stumbling and falling around. But really, Joshua Judd had 2 left feet. He had 2 right feet also, but I'll have to tell you about that during the story. I think I should go back and let you know how Joshua was presented to his parents. Now, most of us, as we're studying culture, are born into our culture. So therefore, we identify with the culture that we're born into. But what if you were born in mysterious circumstances, like Joshua Judd? You see, one morning, Mr. Judd was going out to work, and he opened the door, and he picked up his foot to step on the wall, and he stepped back. Because right where he usually stepped was a baby in a basket. Baby in a little wicker basket. And he looked down and he smiled because the baby smiled at him. And when the baby smiled at him, he started to laugh because the baby had no teeth. And the baby started to laugh. And they looked at each other and it was love at first sight. So Mr. Judd picked up the basket and he ran into the living room and he talked to his wife. He said, "Look what I found on our front step." What he had found was a little baby in a wicker basket, and 2 really snug cotton covers were covering most of the baby. And on his head, he had a little knit cotton cap. And the baby was very, very cute. And so they unwrapped the baby and found out right away that he was a normal little boy. He had two hands, 5 fingers on each hand, 2 little legs, 5 toes on each foot. And they looked at him, and you know, for the life of him, they could not figure out his culture. You see, in some lights, he looked Asian. In some lights, he looked African American. And sometimes he looked, well, European. And sometimes they just couldn't figure it out, but they weren't disturbed because Mr. and Mrs. Judd were from different cultures. Mrs. Judd was from Africa, and Mr. Judd was from Romania. And so they loved this little boy, but they said, who put him here? And as they were unfastening the covers and taking off the covers, they found a little note. What do you think the note said? Anybody got an idea? What do you think the note said? Wow, did you read the note too? The note said they didn't have any money, and so here's a baby for you. It almost said exactly that. It said, please adopt Joshua, our little boy, because we don't have any money to support him. It wasn't signed. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Judd, they looked around and they looked around the neighborhood, and they knocked on doors, but no one had seen anyone leave the little baby boy. So they went to the police, and the police searched diligently, and then social services was called in, and all of this went on for weeks. But meanwhile, social services asked, could the judge keep the little boy? So they were glad to keep the little boy, and Joshua became a part of their family. Joshua, by the way, has a very unusual form. You see, I told you he had 2 arms, he had 2 legs. But what they noticed about Joshua was Joshua's legs were pretty big for his body. I mean, they were shaped like everybody else's legs, but they were pretty big for a baby's legs. But Mrs. Judd loved Joshua, and so did Mr. Judd. So things went on for a while until Joshua started to, first you crawl, then you walk, and kind of in between, there's a thing that children do called toddle. Anybody have a toddler? Then you know what I mean. First of all, Joshua never walked at a sedate pace. He never walked like this. Joshua was always running. He ran around the clock. He would fall down, he'd get back up, and he'd run some more. Well, one day, Mrs. Judd was watching Joshua in the living room, and she heard the doorbell ring. So, she went to the door, and the door, by the way, they have a big house, was a long way from the living room where she left Joshua. And she went to the door, she opened the door, and there was the mailman with a package. And she looked down, felt a tug on her dress, and she looked down, and there was Joshua. So she thought, how did Joshua get here that fast? She kind of scratched her head. Long way to come. But it's okay. Well, it didn't take long for them to discover how come Joshua was so fast. You see, about 2 weeks later, Mr. Judd put his key in the door, and when Joshua heard the key, a strange thing happened. First of all, a little ankle came out of each ankle. It went whoop. Then, at the end of each ankle, a little foot put on. He said, and there he was, and he took off to the door. He was running so fast they could hardly keep up with him, and he leaped into his father's arms. And to say that Mr. and Mrs. Judd were astonished is just not to say enough. But they were afraid for Joshua because, in our society, when anyone is different, people sometimes don't understand. So what they thought they'd do is they would tell Joshua, you cannot get excited because that's when the little transformation would take place. And you cannot be scared because if you get scared, then you have 2 left feet and 2 right feet. And people are going to talk. But it was very hard for them to keep this under wraps. In fact, they didn't send Joshua Judd to school until he was old enough to go to the 1st grade. And on the way to the 1st grade, they made him a special pair of sharp pants. Joshua always wore sharp pants. And he went to the school, and his instructions were never to get excited or scared. Now, that's a tall order, isn't it? And things went along pretty well until Joshua was 9 years old. And one day when he was 9 years old, he was standing in the schoolyard, and him and a bunch of his friends, and a little preschooler found out that a delivery man had left a gate open. So what he did was immediately look across the street, and the house across the street looked like his house. So he started to run across the street. Boy, the girls, we know not to run across the street. They'd be out looking both ways, right? Yeah. But this little boy had forgotten. He was very excited. So as he ran out the gate, Joshua Judd and his friends saw him. And before Joshua could even think about it, bloop, bloop, zoop, and there were the 2 left feet, the 2 right feet, and Joshua took off after the little boy. He looked and he saw a car coming down the street, and it was coming very fast. And Joshua ran very fast. He ran, he scooped up the little boy, and he stood on the sidewalk. And the other students were astonished. They were astonished. First of all, it was strange enough to see a boy with 2 left feet and 2 right feet. But how fast he went and got the baby was amazing to them. And as he brought the little boy back, the kids and the parent and the teachers were all astonished. And they said, wow, did you see? It looked like he was on a bicycle. He was going so fast. And from that moment on, Joshua Judd was known as Joshua Judd, the bicycle boy. Now, I can tell you a lot more about adventures of Joshua, but I won't right now. I will tell you this. He couldn't dance. The left feet and the right foot would get tangled up, and Joshua couldn't dance. But Joshua was Joshua Judd, bicycle boy. That's it. Thank you for inviting me. And one day I'll come back and tell you further adventures of Joshua Judd, bicycle boy.
Okay, boys and girls, you are doing a fantastic job. Let's give Mr. Ralph Rivers, our storyteller,